Alright, let's talk about what might just be one of the most incredible economic stories of the last 100 years, the rise of South Korea. I mean, it's a journey from complete and utter devastation to a global powerhouse, and it really offers a stunning blueprint for how a nation can transform itself. So, just try to get your head around this. Back in 1960, after a really brutal war, South Korea was one of the poorest countries on the planet. We're talking widespread poverty, a future that looked pretty bleak. And today? Well, you know the names, Samsung, Hyundai. They make the semiconductors that power our entire world and K-pop groups that sell out stadiums everywhere. So our story really kicks off in the early 1960s, with a country that was basically on its knees. The infrastructure was rubble, the economy was going nowhere, and they were dependent on foreign aid just to get by. But the government at the time made a huge decision. They decided that just waiting for things to get better wasn't an option. Nope. They were going to engineer a recovery with a really bold, state-driven plan to industrialize that, frankly, a breakneck pace. And here was the playbook they came up with. It was a top-down strategy with 4 key parts. First, they mapped everything out with these super detailed 5-year plans. Second, and this is probably the most important piece of the puzzle, they decided not to just make stuff for themselves, but to make it for the world. An export-first strategy right from the get-go. Third, the government didn't just sit back and hope for the best. It actively picked winners, funneling cheap loans, subsidies, you name it, to key industries to turn them into global champions. And finally, they built the literal foundation for all of it. The ports, the highways, the power grids, everything you need to run a modern economy. Now, this first phase of the miracle, it wasn't about fancy cutting-edge tech. Not at all. It was built on the one massive resource the country had in abundance. Its people. You see, South Korea had this huge, educated, and pretty low-cost workforce. The whole strategy was basically to unleash that human capital, and wow, this chart right here shows you the result. It is absolutely stunning. That line isn't just a squiggly piece of data, it's a rocket launch. You can see the GDP growth just going through the roof, hitting double digits again and again. This wasn't some slow, gradual improvement. This was a full-on economic explosion, and it was lit directly by that government plan to export, export, export. Of course, an economic explosion like that triggers a huge social one too. We're talking about a whole generation of people on the move. Millions left their farms and villages and headed for the booming cities to find work in these new factories. This migration was the fuel for the industrial engine, and in just a couple of decades, it completely transformed South Korea from this traditional agrarian society into a modern industrial nation. So what was everybody making in these brand new factories? Well, at the start, it was all about simple, labor-intensive stuff. Think textiles, shoes, even wigs, and doing basic electronics assembly. You know, putting together radios and TVs for big foreign brands. These were the perfect products for that moment because they didn't require a ton of money to get started, just a lot of skilled hands. But here's the thing, the model was almost a victim of its own success. As the country got richer, those factory workers' wages started to go up, which started to chip away at that low-cost advantage. And at the exact same time, other developing countries were looking at South Korea's success and thinking, hey, we can do that too. So you had a flood of new, cheaper competition. The engine of the miracle was starting to sputter. So, South Korea found itself at a major crossroads. It was either evolve or stagnate. And what happened next was the second great transformation, a huge, very deliberate pivot away from an economy built on hands to one built on brains, on technology, and on innovation. And this really lays out the challenge perfectly. On one side, you've got the past, making simple things like clothes where your advantage is low wages. On the other side, you have the future, creating incredibly complex, high-value things like microchips, which depend entirely on advanced tech and know-how. The challenge for the entire nation was how to make the leap from one side to the other. So how do you make a leap like that? Well, you make a massive, sustained national bet on innovation. The answer was investment. Both the government and the big Korean companies started pouring more and more of their money into research and development, or R&D. This was a strategic choice to build, basically from scratch, the knowledge they needed to compete in the industries of the future. And that huge bet on R&D, man, did it pay off. It paid off in ways I don't think anyone could have possibly imagined. The 2000s is when we see the spectacular emergence of the South Korea that we know today. A global leader in tech, and, kind of out of nowhere, a global leader in culture too. So a whole new set of economic engines took over. We're talking about total dominance in information tech, you know, the memory chips in our phones, the screens on our TVs, but it didn't stop there. They saw growth in really sophisticated areas like biotech and finance. And then, of course, there's the Korean wave, or Hallyu, the global explosion of K-pop and K-dramas, which became this incredibly powerful cultural and economic export. Now, there was this massive outside factor that just turbocharged this whole phase, the rise of China. As China became the factory of the world, it needed an insane amount of high-tech parts, memory chips, processors, screens, to build all that stuff. And who was perfectly positioned right next door to supply them? South Korea. This created this powerful symbiotic relationship that just fueled Korean growth for decades. And if you want a single, stark number to show you how successful this was, just look at this. At its peak, exports made up more than half of South Korea's entire economy. Think about that for a second. That's an almost unbelievable level of dependence on the global economy. But that kind of dependence also hides a pretty big vulnerability, which brings us to right now. Because that stable, globalizing world that let the export-first model work so well, it's changing, and it's changing fast. The playbook that worked so brilliantly for 60 years is now running into some very powerful new headwinds. The new buzzword you'll hear is slow globalization. After decades of the world getting more and more connected, that whole process is kind of hitting the brakes. We're seeing more trade tensions, geopolitical friction, think the US and China, and countries are getting more focused on their own economic security. For a country like South Korea, whose entire model is built on smooth, easy global trade, this is a fundamental threat. And this isn't just some theory. Experts are really sounding the alarm. This quote here really captures the irony. It says the very model that created the miracle may have finally hit its limit and could now actually be a source of instability. And here's the other shoe dropping. That relationship with China, which was such a powerful tailwind for so long, is now reversing course. You see, China isn't content to just assemble products anymore. It's pouring billions into developing its own high-tech industries. Suddenly, South Korea's biggest customer is turning into its fiercest competitor. And so that leaves us with this huge, powerful question for the future. South Korea has already pulled off two economic miracles. First, going from ashes to an industrial giant, and second, from that giant to a leader in tech and innovation. Now, facing a more fractured world and powerful new rivals, the big question is, can it engineer a third miracle? Can it invent a whole new economic model for an entirely new era?